Well, the face of South African politics has transformed in the 3 decades of our country's democracy, with opposition political parties and smaller parties determined to leave a dent on the ANC's historic popularity. As we mark 50 days until the 29th of May elections, this morning we take a look at how politics shaped our present through the book Who Will Rule South Africa, written by award-winning journalists Adriaan Basson and Qaanitah Hunter. The book gives us an in-depth account on some of the events that made us ask how we got here as a country. Well, hopefully to answer some of those questions, we're joined in studio by Qaanitah Hunter, who's the co-author of the book Who Will Rule South Africa. Qaanitah, it's great to have you in studio. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, so let's bring this one up front, because I'm going to put the cover back on, if I can ask my director to do that. As you can see, there's all the key role players, the opposition parties, the current leader of South Africa, but the big face missing there is perhaps the MK party. So let's talk about that. That was not a part of the political landscape when this book was written and published, was it?
So MK party was not registered when we published this book, but also former President Jacob Zuma, as per the Constitution, cannot govern South Africa for another term, as is the Electoral Court hearing today. And so his picture is notably not on the cover of this book. However, we do track his significance and his role in South African politics, and definitely not something that we predicted, that a former president of the ANC would launch a political party, or would be part of a political party that would have absolutely no other ambition but to reduce the ANC support.
Yeah, indeed. And I bring this up because obviously former President Jacob Zuma plays a massive role in the trajectory of South Africa and the politics, and you outline this and take this as a big theme throughout the book. In fact, the very first chapter is talking about the day that the president, our former president, went and started serving. He handed himself over and started serving, and some of the behind-the-scenes things that were happening. Perhaps you want to start there, because that's where things really started to get quite complicated here in South Africa.
I think the important thing to track, Leanne, is that politics moves so quickly in South Africa, and there's so many things happening at so many times, and we sometimes forget how all of these are interrelated and how they affect us. And so when you look at a moment in a South African democracy, as young as it is, 30 years is a very young, and in 2021 we were even younger, or when there was the arrest of a former head of state, something unprecedented, something massive, and a test for democracy in many ways. And you would know that I obviously focused a lot of my time and attention in a previous book that we had written called 8 Days in July in that moment. But to understand the resilience of our democracy, and to understand the nuances that exist, we had to reflect on that particular critical moment, that a former president was convicted of contempt of another arm of state, the judiciary, the apex court, the Constitution with which he served as President of the Republic. He took an oath of office. And so that scene sort of set the tone of what, kind of the ultimate decay under the former President Jacob Zuma. But we don't sort of start our tracking of the South Africa's journey with democracy or we don't pin it in the Jacob Zuma years. This is a story that we track all the way from 1994, particularly because it's important to 30 years later is a good time to sit back and say, right, how did we get here? So where did we come from? Where are we now? And more importantly, where are we headed to?
Yeah, and that's the great thing about this book. I mean, it's really like 200 pages of going back and looking at the events that have shaped us from that pivotal moment of '94 up until here. I mean, you cover many things, from the breakdown of state-owned entities like Eskom. You have a look at the history of it, where it was, where it started, where the warning signs came, and how we landed up here. We talk about Jacob Zuma. You talk about Cyril Ramaphosa, and that one's quite an interesting one, of our president, the new yawn, as opposed to the new dawn. I mean, there's a real sort of, there's no breaking news in this. This is just a recollection of where we've come from, building up to these elections, and then starting to look deeper into where we are as a country and the political dynamic. We keep saying that these are going to be the most pivotal and important elections we've ever had in this country. Do you agree? I mean, is this, in your opinion, and what you've seen happening, a massive turning point in South Africa's history?
So we had to reflect on that when we were writing this. Is it hyperbole? Is it this exaggeration that 2024 is 1994? And the question is an important one. Why is there a lot of focus on this? And I think it's multiple things. First, 30 years is a substantial enough time to appraise a democratic government. That's the first thing. Second, we are heading to the inevitability of coalition governments, almost certainly on provincial level and expectedly on national level. And that changes things, right? That definitely takes the democracy into another transition. And that's why we say the rise of a new democracy. We're going to see a different manifestation of what we've seen previously. And the third thing, I think, is why the 2024 elections is marked as such a critical one, despite the fact that every election is deemed important. And I don't think there's a single election that's kind of regarded in a nonchalant way. But I think this one, it's particularly because of what it means in the context of change and in the context of decay as a country. If you look at all indicators around poverty, unemployment, inequality, we are in a quagmire as South Africa, struggling to get out of the chokeholds of these triple challenges. And so this 2024 moment is fashioned in that way of 1994, in not so much that the country is coming together to rule out an illegitimate government, as it were, with the apartheid government. That's not the reference. The reference more is this this precipice of change. South Africa is on this precipice of change, whether it is from a single-party governance system to a multi-party coalition scenario, or we may see in some provinces the ANC perhaps even losing the provinces to coalition governments. And so a very, very fluid and interesting political terrain.
Yeah, indeed, it certainly is. And one of those moments that we do certainly find ourselves in as a country where, you know, we have known the domination of the ANC. That's what we have seen, particularly on a national level. But in this book, you look at different scenarios, and I think that's what a lot of people want to see, is through everything we've seen, through the emergence of all of these smaller players, through the growth of the EFF, perhaps the little bit of a decline of the DA, and the emergence, as I say, of these new parties. You look at scenarios of what could happen. Let's perhaps look at those, because I think that's what people really want to focus on as we sit 50 days before the elections. In your first scenario, you talk about the same old, that the ANC gets its majority and it can carry on the way it has been. How likely is something like that to happen?
So the interesting thing, Leanne, is that politics doesn't often happen in a vacuum. We always have scenarios which we can locate political developments and to understand what can happen and what is likely to happen. And so we have the local government scenario to kind of show us what could possibly play out. And so if we reflect on what happened in local government, we have these different scenarios. What I like to call the Mangaung scenario. The Mangaung scenario, where 2021, the ANC just about got a majority. It's not smooth sailing, because obviously it doesn't have that ultimate majority where you can just pass decisions and pass budgets, etc. It has to be, you know, completely on its toes, because if an ANC councillor is absent, so if the ANC just gets 50+1 in the National Assembly, it's easy for them because they can form a government, they can pass budgets, but obviously changing the constitution, passing legislation can become a lot trickier. But that is the first scenario. How likely is it? I think that, earlier polls last year put the ANC at just about 50 or under 50. I think now the polls are putting the ANC at, far below that 50 mark. But I do think the ANC is trying everything in its power nationally to just clinch on that majority. Then we have the second option, which is an interesting one, and what I call the Rustenburg option, where the ANC just got under 50%. And by getting under 50%, it was an easy one, because what it did was it went to two small political parties and said to them, vote with us to form a government and we'll give you a position or two. That was an easy one easy coalition to form. And so look at this scenario. Cyril Ramaphosa is the president of the ANC. The ANC gets 48%. Or let's use seats, for example. The ANC gets 198 seats. It needs 3 seats, or it needs 4 seats, or even 5 seats. It can go to the smaller political parties that are more amenable to it and say, right, vote with us and we'll give you a position. And that's where small political parties have the role of becoming kingmakers.
Yeah, the kingmakers over there. And is that possibly the scenario we're looking at? Or are we looking at a little bit more of a difficult and dire situation for the ANC in the run-up, in everything you're covering, in terms of voter sentiment and where we're at? Do you think that they could perhaps drop below that 40% mark, which people are looking at and analysts are saying is highly possible, and then it makes it more complicated?
It does make it more complicated. I think the best case scenario is the upper 40%, 48. That's the best case scenario for the ANC. And we're talking about nationally. Obviously, what happens in the provinces changes.
Different story altogether,
different story, but also affects the national vote. So, and without getting very technically, and I think that KwaZulu-Natal, we cannot underplay the importance of the vote in KwaZulu-Natal. And that KwaZulu-Natal sort of comprises of 20% of the electorate. And so how the ANC fares in KZN will really affect how it plays out. Gauteng, sure, but KZN
is the big one.
Is the big one.
And in the book, which as I mentioned right up front, the MK party is missing from this. If you had to write them into this book now, because this is now looking at where we're at without them, now they're in, how would this change? How does this change the political scene, particularly in KZN and the performance of the ANC there?
What it does is that it fragments the ANC almost in half. It takes the ANC's support and it cracks it into half. And so the ANC got 54% in the last election. And so what all polls are putting the MKP at about 24-25%. Some polls are putting it as the largest party in KwaZulu-Natal at the moment. The ANC is loath to concede, to say that the MK is eating into their support base. But the MK party has no sort of a motive to recruit supporters of the IFP, to recruit supporters of other political parties. It really is going into areas that have seen ANC factionalism. So you're looking at areas like eThekwini, areas like Mpangeni, areas like Lower South Coast. These are areas that have had the historic ANC factionalism, between the supporters of former President Jacob Zuma and those aligned with President Cyril Ramaphosa. And that is where that fracture you see, where large swaths of ANC support base is moving over to the MKP. Now the big question is, and that's what's going to be heard, and that's why writing a book about in anticipation of an election is a difficult task, because it's a fluid political terrain. Yeah. The Independent Electoral Commission has said, well, Jacob Zuma cannot be in the ballot because of the Constitution. The Constitution prohibits someone who was sentenced to more than 12 months in jail without an option for fine to be a candidate on the list to Parliament. And so now that's what the Electoral Court is going to hear. So the question is, and that also, the strength of the MKP is also going to be tested of what strength does it have if Jacob Zuma is not the face
and he's not there.
Yes.
So that's going to be also something to watch on there. I also want to look at those scenarios, because you also look at the prospect of either an ANC EFF coalition or an ANC DA coalition. Yeah. Which one is more likely, and what the parties would look like? I mean, the chances of with the EFF, you talk about a scenario where Paul Mashatile would become the president and then Julius Malema perhaps the deputy president. On the other side, you would maybe even see someone like a John Steenhuisen being a deputy president if we get to that point where those deals are made. But how likely are these? I mean, looking at where we're at.
Yeah. So the scenario of the ANC being unable to cobble together a stable government with small political parties is a reality, and we've seen it in different municipalities, in the metros, right, where it had to make a deal in Ekurhuleni with the EFF, right, And the ANC tested the waters, although both the ANC and the EFF will swear to you that they are not in coalition, but they are in coalition, at least in Ekurhuleni and in eThekwini, where they govern in the same government.
Indeed,
right?
yeah.
And so, but it has proven to be a very, very difficult agreement. You would have seen in Ekurhuleni, EFF councillors physically stormed ANC councillors, and there was violence in the council chamber. And so those relationships are extremely fragile. I want to just pivot a little bit, Leanne, to talk about how I think we are underprepared for what's to come in terms of coalitions. We have not learned the lesson from local government. For example, we do not have any legislation that governs how coalition agreements are entered into. So we actually will have no clue should the ANC and the EFF come out within 30 days after the election results are declared, or within 2 weeks after the election results are declared, and say we are forming a government together. We wouldn't know what would be the agreement. Similarly, if we have what many people are pushing for as the stability option, where you have an ANC DA agreement, which obviously the DA denies to say that they don't want to, but these iterations, when it comes to coalitions, everything's on the table, and it becomes a personality maneuvering, who outmaneuvers the other best and who comes forward with a better deal. And so the reality of it is that whereas 2 years ago in the ANC, it would have probably been unheard of for the ANC to form some sort of allegiance with the Democratic Alliance. Now you're hearing from ANC veterans, you're hearing it from so many other quarters within the ANC to say, we have an EFF-ANC marriage is probably the worst thing that could be for the ANC, because Julius Malema had said it to me on record that the way to eat a crocodile is from the inside, and so that exists. But at the same time, how would the machinations in terms of the personalities between an ANC DA grand coalition work? And again, there was something off the table until very recently, where ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula said that at some point there probably will have to be open to grand coalitions in the interest of stability. So again, a very, very fluid moment. But we do not have a say as South Africans to say coalitions are good or bad. It is what the voters. If the voters don't give a single party a majority, it is what it is.
That's what we've asked for. This is going. Like we said to you, this is a very interesting election. But if you want to know how we got here, because this was kind of a rundown to the elections and what we could possibly see, some of the scenarios, we didn't even get to the Moonshot Pact, because that's also discussed in here, as well as the different parties, the smaller parties, and the events that have led us to this moment, and certainly the look at the ANC and how they have, through the years, managed to sort of drop those votings all the time. This is the book that outlines it for you. So if you want to have a look at it, go out there, buy it. Who Will Rule South Africa? And this was Qaanitah Hunter, who of course is a co-author of the book with Adriaan Basson. And this talks to us all about the demise of the ANC and the rise of a new democracy.